Growing up in a Filipino American church was a big part of my life, and it was such a joy seeing my youth group and my church friends on church on Sunday. I grew up as an only child, so I didn't have any brothers or sisters, but when I would go to church, we would have these kuyas and ates, and in English that just means older brother and older sister. And I really had that sense of older brother and older sister. I had these sibling type relationships in my church. And I also grew up here in America, so I didn't grow up with my aunts and uncles who are in the Philippines. But when I would go to church, we would use the word tito and tita. And those just mean uncle and aunt in English. So I got to experience sort of like a family type relationship when I would go to church. So I really enjoyed growing up in those Filipino American churches. And when I was even in high school, I started to see my youth group as more like my closest community. When I was in high school, I kind of didn't want to invest too much time with my high school friends, because I had this idea that when we graduate from high school, I may never see these people again. So I really invested my time on my youth group, being in the community of my youth group. But something interesting happened is when we graduated high school, I found that a lot of my generation started to leave the church. They would be too involved in their colleges, and then they wouldn't be involved in the youth group. But something was really cool though is the ones who end up staying. There was a remnant. There was a group that ended up staying at our church, and it was a really fun time because we were all growing in our walks with the Lord, and we had a lot of encouragement amongst one another. But eventually they all left, and this happened in 2015. Maybe they got married, or they wanted to move to another state, or maybe they just didn't like being at our church anymore. They wanted to go to another church. So these people, they left, and I was the only one left at my church. And it was my first time experiencing what is called the silent exodus, which is this phenomenon where the second generation leave the first generation. They leave their home churches and they go to other churches, or maybe they never even go to church again. But the idea is that they leave the home church. And this was painful for me to experience because this was my community. These were like people that I grew up with, and now they're people I used to see maybe 3 times, 4 times a week, but now I rarely see them. So that was hard for me. And I also started to see this happening in other churches. It wasn't just my church, but I started to see it happening in other Asian American churches, whether it be Chinese, Korean, or Filipino. And I was starting to see this trend happening. And so what I thought in my mind was, I kind of want to stop this trend from happening. I wanted to stop the cycle, because what I noticed is that people would leave the church because their mentors left the church. And so it seems like the second generation would leave, and then the people that they were discipling at that church, they eventually grew up and then they would leave too. So I wanted to stop that cycle. I wanted to focus on the youth group at my church and try to improve the church so that these youth kids would not leave our home church. And the way I wanted to do that is by making a safe place for them to worship the way that they wanted, to give them some freedom and give them some sort of ministry where they would feel that they're welcome in their own church. And long story short, I ended up leaving too. I ended up leaving that church too, and it was hard for me, and I still love that church. But a lot of feelings of failure started to come to my mind because I was trying to avoid this thing from happening, but I ended up leaving too. And then I also started seeing the ones that I was mentoring also start to leave too. And I can see that this is a pain that a lot of churches are feeling. It's not just me, it's also pastors of other churches. They're feeling this pain of the second generation leaving. So all that to say, I've been reading this book. It's a book by Tim Keller called Every Good Endeavor, and it's about work. But I think something that I read this week really applies to this situation, and I'm going to read a part from this book. And he cites a passage from Genesis 3. He's talking about how work is sometimes painful, and it's not by design. It's just because of the sin that's in the world. But he said that even though we work and then we do these things the best that we can, there will still be some disappointment and hardship because of sin. And he cites this He cites this passage in Genesis 3:18. It says, "Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field." After Adam sinned and the fall came into the world, his work was tarnished, or his work was tainted, so that it wasn't something that was enjoyable anymore. It was starting to be something that he would harvest, and then there would be thorns and thistles within his crops. And I think that really applies to even ministry in the second generation settings. We can work in the second generation setting, and then we think we really have this vision for what we want the church to be like. We want it to be a church that is welcoming to the second generation, but then there will be thorns and thistles. There will be disappointments. And I want to read this encouragement from Tim Keller. He said on page 94, "Just because you cannot realize your highest aspirations in work does not mean you have chosen wrongly or are not called to your profession, or that you could spend your life looking for the perfect career that is devoid of frustration." I like this because it really comforted me, because when I was looking back at my time in ministry during that time, I felt that because I had failed in a sense, that means that what I did was a waste of time, or what I did was a failure. But from this passage, he said, just because you can't realize the highest aspiration, that doesn't mean that you were a failure, basically, is the comfort that I got from this. Tim Keller talks about this story that Tolkien wrote, and it's a story called Leaf by Nigel. It's about an artist named Nigel, and he was trying to paint this tree. And I'll read the quote. He says, "Nigel imagined a beautiful tree that he was never able to produce in paint during his life. So he died weeping that his picture, the great work of his life, was not completed. No one would ever see it. And yet when he got to the heavenly country, there was the tree." This was Tolkien's way of saying to us, and as well to himself, that our deepest aspirations and work will come to complete fruition in God's future. So the reason why I found a lot of comfort in this is because I think we have this vision where the second generation and the first generation, they can worship together in the same church, and that we can have that family type relationship, and we don't leave each other, and we cause pain from leaving our community, from leaving like our family, so to speak. But we can look forward to the future in heaven, where we are God's people, God's family, worshiping together, and there we can see the ultimate aspiration that we wanted. And so even though we feel like we failed in ministry, even though we're feeling discouraged, we can look forward to the future where we will not have that sort of discouragement, but rather we will be able to experience the vision that we had in our minds. All right, so I hope that made sense. I hope you found some encouragement in that. And I'd love to hear from you too, if you had experience or you have experiences of the second generation leaving your home church as well. I'd love to hear what your experience was like and how you dealt with it. And hopefully we can all grieve together, and we can also all look forward to the future together.